and joined by Dale Glover and Luis Dizon, and we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin today and whether or not it is authentic. And we, in fact, have a presentation that Dale is going to be giving us on the subject. Dale, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, I was really excited that you and Lewis agreed to do this because I was telling you guys behind the scenes that I think the shroud is very important evidence, and it's actually really strong evidence akin to the historical evidence for the resurrection. So, yeah, looking forward to giving my case.
Absolutely. Hey, Luis, how you doing? You able to
Sorry.
hear us?
Yep, I'm great. I'm excited to do this. I've actually been doing a bit of my own research on this topic in
Oh,
preparation for this. Like, I didn't dig too deep, but a lot of the material that is relevant to this topic, especially in the last little while, is interesting, and a lot of it
mhm.
confirms what Dale has in his presentation. So I'm looking forward to this as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dale, if you have a presentation that you want to go ahead and share on your screen, go ahead and add it and let's dive in.
All right, cool. So yeah, just so the audience knows, I've kind of divided this up into two segments. The
Hmm.
first looking at the historicity of the shroud for about 20 minutes or so, and then the second presentation on the scientific evidence about the shroud images and how those were formed. So, yep, hopefully that's right.
Hmm.
You guys seen that? Oops.
Mm. Okay, the presentation there. Yeah, we could see that.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start with the historicity of the shroud. So in terms of the shroud, obviously there are two main sides. There's the pro shroud guys, that's me, and then there's the shroud skeptics. In terms of the full history of the shroud on the pro shroud side, there are really two major theories. So the most popular one is what's called known as the Dandelion or the image of Edessa theory. So it kind of proposes, hey, the shroud from Jerusalem covered Jesus' body in 30 to 33 AD, whatever date you pick. And then from there, it was moved to Edessa sometime in the first century. And from there, it was lost for about 500 years until I think it was a flood happened and destroyed part of the wall. And it was rediscovered. And from there, it became known as the image of Edessa. Um, and then obviously from there, it was transferred to Constantinople in around 944 AD. Contrary-wise, there's another alternative called the Image of God Incarnate, and that's by my friend Shroud historian Jack Markward. So basically, instead of going to Edessa, it went to Antioch, and it became lost for a period of 500 years until the 540s, and then it was rediscovered, and then subsequently moved from one place and ending up in Constantinople. The Shroud skeptics, on the other hand, very simple. Look, it didn't exist until the 1290 to 1320, in and around that date, and it was a medieval creation sometime in Europe or France. Okay, so how do we decide which of these theories are true? Well, on the pro shroud side, there are at least 18 pieces of historical evidence that can show the shroud predates the medieval period. By contrast, there are really only two, if I'm being generous, three pieces of evidence that purport to show the shroud originated in the medieval period. And it's really important. Look, you can't pick and choose which bits of evidence you want to look at. You have to look at all the evidence to make an informed decision. Okay, so obviously my presentation, just as a disclaimer, because I know Hugh Ferry will be out in the comments and scolding me. I'm not providing a nuanced presentation. I'm kind of going to be providing the pro shroud case. And if you guys want to ask me about, well, how do shroud skeptics respond to some of this stuff, maybe we could cover that in the Q&A and stuff afterwards. But yeah, so obviously the main shroud skeptical evidence is the 1988 carbon-14 dating. Hey, wasn't this thing dated and published in a peer-reviewed journal in Nature that proved it dated between 1260 to 1390? Yeah, absolutely, it was. There are at least three problems, though, and why you can't rely on the carbon dating to date the shroud. The first is that this thing was only dated one sample location. Originally, look, all experts, archaeologists, carbon 14 scientists, they recognize this as an insufficient sample size. You have to test different locations to mitigate against contamination, errors, stuff like that. And look, even the AMS carbon dating inventor, Harry Gove, he was the guy who invented the carbon 14 method used. He was the guy in charge of dating the shroud. Even he admitted when he found out they changed it from dating 3 sample locations down to 1, he said, quote unquote, the use of a single sample is ill advised as it will not generate a reliable date, but will rather give rise to world controversy. We suggest it would be better not to date the shroud at all. So this is bang on. I think, look, you're not justified until more datings from different locations on that cloth are done. Additionally, there are also various evidences that suggest the sample that they picked was non-representative to the rest of the cloth. So, we find cotton, for example, which is not found elsewhere on the Shroud of Turin. It's only in this one little corner piece of the shroud that they dated. Or we have blue quad mosaic imaging, which kind of looks at the chemical composition of certain areas, stuff of this nature. And finally, most importantly, in 2017, a friend of Barry Schwartz named Tristan Casabianca actually went after the British Museum through the Freedom of Information Act, and they looked at the raw dates that the carbon-14 scientists got and did not report in their Nature paper. And guess what? Look, they discovered there was 16 raw values, not the 12 that they reported on. And because of this, statisticians have proven and published in at least 5 secular peer-reviewed journals, including Archaeometry, which I think is associated with the Oxford lab that dated it. Look, there is a 98.6% probability that there's some kind of systematic measurement error that accounts for all 16 of those raw values that the labs got. And because of this means that they can't claim to have a 95% degree of certainty. And this is an international statistical standard. You can kind of see the 3 labs here. You can see my mouse, but you can see none of them overlap, right? They're way off. This in 1989, these people assigned, the line of best fit is right here at 1260, but it doesn't even hit these other 2 labs. So yeah, really, this is the line of best fit. And it shows there's a slope of about 36 years per centimeter of cloth. So starting from the very edge of the cloth, the carbon date of that cloth is going up by 36 years as you keep going closer and closer in. So there's some kind of systematic measurement bias in the results that they've gotten there. So because of that, we can't really have confidence until we figure out what the heck is that systematic measurement bias, what's causing that. Okay, so in terms of pro-shroud explanations for the carbon-14 results, because even if we can't rely on it to determine that it's medieval, we still have to explain, well, how did they get these erroneous results? And there's been various explanations over the years, ranging from conspiracy theories, which no one credible really believes. There are obviously ordinary contamination, so just things like fire or talc or wax and stuff like that. However, the 2 main ones that are still viable today is really the invisible reweave hypothesis from my friend Joe Marino. People like Ray Rogers, they go for this, and just says in the Renaissance period, French reweavers put a patch on the shroud. And when you carbon date that, if you have material from the 30 AD and then material from the 1500s when they put on this patch, well, the combined average will give you around the 1325 area or something like that. And then there's the one that I think is the most promising. It's the neutron absorption hypothesis, again, by my friend Bob Rucker. Basically says, look, during the resurrection, Jesus disappeared and a bunch of neutrons irradiated out. And as we know scientifically, and Bob has actually calculated this using MCNP, Monte Carlo neutron particle software that the government of the United States uses, and he's calculated it all out. And guess what? If that happened, it would actually correlate and give us the exact results we got in terms of the carbon dating. Okay, so let's switch gears here to the pro-shroud side. What are some of these 18 evidences that we have on that side? So one of the main arguments here is kind of looking at art history and numismatic coins and looking at the features of how Jesus is depicted and comparing that to the shroud and saying, well, there are certain features present that really must mean these artists were copying the Shroud of Turin. And look, this isn't just a Christian or a pro-shroud argument. Famously, art historians that are secular, non-religious agnostics, like Thomas de Westlo, has even written an entire book arguing that certain artistic representations must have been based on the shroud. And one such example is what's called the Hungarian Prayer Codex. So it's a little bit stretched out. It's not great, but you can kind of see there's an upper panel depicting they're anointing the body of Jesus and that. And there are certain features here. So, okay, on the pro shroud side, he's got his arms crossed right over the left, just like the shroud. He's only got 4 fingers showing. He's also naked, which I think is one of the more important ones, because up until this period of time in the 1190s, look, it's very unusual. There are maybe 1 or 2 images of Jesus where he's naked, and that's usually related to his baptism. They never depict Jesus naked in these kinds of scenes at that time. The other in the lower panel, this is, according to the pro shroud side, this is the shroud cloth that we have here. And some of the telling features that suggest that are, look, we have the herringbone weave pattern represented by these staircase patterns. And we've identified some people trying to depict these patterns in the same way elsewhere. And the main one, there's no way for me to zoom, but the main one is there's a series of holes here in the shape of an L. I don't know if that's, is that coming through to you guys, or can you guys see that?
Yeah, it's a little distorted, but I can see it.
Gotcha. So what the pro shroud side claims, this is the most compelling evidence to my mind, to be honest, is that there's a series of poker holes on the shroud, or burn holes, that are exactly in this configuration, in this shape of an L, that's kind of depicted here randomly in the middle of the shroud sheet here. So because of that, shroud skeptics don't even have really a good response for what these represent. And even they kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we don't know how to explain that aspect. So yeah, that's kind of the pro shroud argument, is that this is a depiction, albeit a bad one, of the L-shaped poker holes on the Shroud of Turin cloth. We also have the same type of argument with coins, certain Byzantine coins. For example, the Justinian gold solidus coins. Justin Robinson has also done some work and published in peer-reviewed journals about the bronze Follis coins depicting Jesus' face based on the Shroud of Turin. And here's an example, just an image. So, Giulio Fonte, he's actually done statistical calculations, something like 1 divided out of 10 billion chance that all the features on this coin would have been illustrated if the person had not seen the shroud images. And some of his evidence is based on these wounds depicted as tufts of hair on the coins. Okay, the other argument, one that I think is pretty good, is the Sudarium of Oviedo. So this is essentially the purported headcloth of Jesus, and it dates before, we can prove it existed prior to 570 AD in Jerusalem. So yeah, it's earlier than 570. That's what we can prove so far. And guess what? It's been forensically investigated, and it looks like there's a forensic link between the bloodstains and body fluids on both cloths. It looks like they covered the same corpse that had the same wounds. And they also have the same anatomical proportions, the nose, mouth, beard, etc. In 2016, there was a morphological study that showed, as you can see, that the points from which the wounds began seemed to correlate between the people that were covered in the shroud and the Sudarium. And in 2015, there was an X-ray fluorescence study with Cesar Barta that kind of studied the tip of the nose and looked at the calcium deposits. And what do you know? It just so happens that at the tip of the nose on the shroud and the Sudarium, they both have this elevated spike, this uniquely high and unexpected concentration of limestone dust that is consistent with the limestone dust found at Calvary in Jerusalem. Okay, in addition to that, the Shroud skeptics are not the only ones with scientific evidence that can be used to date the Shroud. The pro-Shroud side actually has 5 scientific tests, all that date the Shroud to the 1st century AD. So the first one is a microchemical study that Ray Rogers did and published in 2005 based on the Shroud's vanillin, and it basically found it's comparable to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date to the 1st century, 70 AD at the latest. And more recently, I think more importantly, is Giulio Fonte. He's conducted various physical dating tests. So, you can see on the screen, we have FTIR or infrared dating, Raman spectroscopy, and the mechanical tensile strength, that these things kind of measure the degradation that a linen cloth would go through and kind of dates it that way. And most importantly and interestingly, we actually in 2022, just last year, Fonte and others published a peer-reviewed journal paper about the wax or the X-ray dating in the Heritage Science Journal. And this is based on the depolymerization degree of the cellulose itself. And guess what? All of these things happen to date the Shroud to around the 1st century, about 33 BC, plus or minus 250 years, with that 95% degree of certainty. Remember, that's the international statistical standard that you have to get. If you're less than 95, like with the carbon dating, it's garbage. You can't trust it. If you have the 95 or more degree of confidence, you're good to go. And here's just kind of an illustration of how the dating methods look. So you have the carbon-14 as an outlier all the way out here. You have Giulio Fonte's statistical argument with the coins that places it to 692 or earlier. And then you have his 3 dating methods. And guess what? The only period that they overlap in is the 1st century AD, the time of Jesus. And then here's an example of the peer-reviewed paper on the X-ray dating. And just to finish off here on the history of the Shroud, another argument is that there are possible biblical references to the Shroud of Turin. And really, Larry Stolley is the best on this front. And I even had him on my show debating Dr. Ben Witherington on about 4 of the texts that he claims. To me, I'm a little skeptical, but I think the Galatians 3:1, there may be something to it. And this is a text that says, look, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly or publicly portrayed among you as crucified." And the pro-Shroud, Larry's claim here is that, well, what is it? What's going before these eyes? How are they seeing Jesus portrayed as crucified? They saw the Shroud of Turin images. This is a cryptic way of referring to the Shroud images, according to Larry. And interestingly enough, Ben Witherington also agrees that most biblical scholars are wrong. They take a metaphorical view here and say, oh, no, they're talking about Paul's preaching. It was so vivid that it created the picture of Jesus being crucified before them. But Ben Witherington, who used to agree with that position, said, no, you know what? You're right, Larry. This is talking about something physically before their eyes, literally. Now, what does Ben say it is? Not the Shroud. He thinks it's more talking about the stigmata that Paul mentions later in Galatians. But I think it's open for debate. I think the Shroud images are a possible candidate that deserve to be considered and stuff. So yeah, that's it on the Shroud history. Do you guys want me to take a break or go straight into the science? What do you guys want?
I think it'd be good to, I don't know, Michael. I think Michael has a question, and I have some too, but maybe it's better to save those for towards the end. So maybe best
Cool.
to continue.
All right, cool. Okay, so let's switch gears to the scientific evidence then, like basically looking at the Shroud images and how those were formed. So similar to Dr. Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach in dealing with the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, I've developed what I call the minimal relevant features approach to studying the Shroud. So great. So fancy words. What the heck does minimal relevant features what am I talking about? Well, essentially, I'm talking about the physical and chemical properties of the shroud's body and bloodstain images that were discovered back in 1978 by the Shroud of Turin research project known as STIRP. These were published in 26 or more secular peer-reviewed science journals. They were not religious. They're not, these aren't just religious kooks in any way. These are secular scientists working at labs like Los Alamos Weapons Lab. Some of them were associated with NASA on certain projects. And they published the results in secular peer-reviewed journals and basically studied the shroud to discover these properties that the images have that are pretty remarkable. And there are two criteria to qualify as a minimal relevant feature. The first is obviously that it's highly evidenced and substantiated in credible peer-reviewed literature. And next, at least 2/3 of the informed experts accept this feature as a proven fact. If you've got that, then I consider you a minimal relevant feature. Okay, so what am I talking about? What are some examples of the minimal relevant features? Well, for this presentation, I just want to focus on 5 that are related to the body images in particular. And so the first is the photonegativity, right? So the lights and darks are reversed. It's a mirror image and that sort of thing. So that's what you kind of see all the time. And the black and white photo that you have here. So that's what the negativity is. Some people question that, well, it's not a full negative because the hair would be white. So maybe it's just a quasi-negative image. Again, either way, there is this negativity aspect. The second is the body image uniformity. And this refers to the color of the shroud, the intensity of the colored fibrils of the images are exactly uniform, plus or minus 10% in terms of color. And this is remarkable. They have the same intensity of color on each individual fibril. So it's not like paint or something like that smattered across the board, or where you would have varying degrees of intensity and that sort of thing. And another remarkable aspect is the maximum densities, the maximum darkness of both the frontal image and the dorsal image are the same. They are uniform as well. And that's going to play a role in things like direct contact, for example, where you'd expect the dorsal image to be darker just because of the effects of gravity pressing the body to the cloth and stuff. So you can see where this is important. There's also the remarkable topographical information. We call this the 3-dimensionality. You've seen the VP8 image. Here's the image uniformity. You can see the individual fibrils are colored to the same degree or uniform intensity of color, plus or minus 10%. And then here's the VP8 image analyzer showing that there is 3-dimensional information in the darknesses and lights of the image. And then we also have what's called the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. So this is really an important fact. So you can see if you have a body lying down, here's Jesus, his nose, his cheeks, and that sort of thing. You have a naturally draped cloth, the shroud, over top. So you can see they've actually scientifically proven that the encodation path, the direction that whatever mechanism made those images on the shroud was vertical, was this path P, as they call it, a straight line up. The other option is a curvy linear thing where it curves out and then hits the P spot right there. So, electrostatic mechanisms and stuff. But you have other encodation paths they could have taken, right? So if it was direct contact, if you press the shroud down onto the nose, you would get path A, the absorption path. Or if you have like gas diffusions, you might get path E for emissions, stuff like that. Instead, it's a fact that the shroud's encodation path followed this straight line path P, vertically mapped. Then we finally have the body image superficiality. And there are 3 levels of superficiality. So on the first place, at the fabric level, right, just means the body images don't penetrate to the back of the cloth. That's pretty easy to replicate, but there's also thread level and fibril level superficiality. So in terms of the thread level, this means that because each individual fibril is what's colored individually, only the top 2 to 3 fibrils of each thread is colored. Now, that's amazing because these fibrils have the thickness of a human hair, and each thread is made of about 200 fibrils, let's say. So only the top 2 or 3 are colored, the very surface. And on the fibril level, finally, only the primary cell wall, so Stirp quantified this as 0.2 micrometers of each fibril is colored. So that's what's represented by these straws here. Only the red represents the color, and then the white represents the cloth uncolored. It's only on this very 0.2 micrometers thick is how the color penetrates each fibril. And again, the fibril has the thickness of a human hair. So that is pretty superficial. That's incredible. And there's just an image of what we're talking about in real life from the microscope. Okay, great. So those are the features that we're working with. So now we come to the question of, great, what are the explanatory hypotheses? How do we explain this? And essentially, they come in 3 main categories. There are ordinary artistic mechanisms. So these are things that require some kind of a medieval or otherwise an artist or craftsman to manufacture the shroud images as an artistic work. There are ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, which just requires a dead corpse being put in the shroud, and somehow, some way, ordinary natural mechanisms create these images. And then finally, we have the extraordinary or supernatural mechanisms. That's where I would go. I would fit into that category. And I've just done a little chart to kind of give you a glimpse of some of the main theories where they fit. So you have the ordinary artistic, traditional painting, scorch, protophoto, that sort of thing, ordinary naturalistic mechanisms, extraordinary mechanisms, and that sort of thing. And I'm going to select a few of these just to kind of show you how the minimal relevant features approach can be used to evaluate these types of hypotheses. So let's start with the very first ordinary artistic one, Walter Macrone's traditional painting hypothesis. And this was, as I said, the first skeptical hypothesis. It can be dated back to 1389 when a bishop, Pierre Darcy of Troyes, he made this allegation that an artist fabricated the shroud images, and he had confessed to having painted the images. Well, post 1978, famous microscopist Walter Macrone, he was able to study some of the shroud samples taken from Stirp, and he used his polarized light microscope. And guess what? He claimed to find an iron oxide-based tempera paint or red ochre pigment. And he claimed, well, that's what created an artist took a paintbrush and this red ochre paint, and he painted the body image and he painted the bloodstains. And later on, he was kind of shown to be wrong, and his team discovered one particle of vermilion paint on one single blood sample. So he revised his thing and said, oh, well, somebody must have touched up the bloodstains, all of the bloodstains, with red vermilion pigment afterwards at a later date. So that was what his traditional painting hypothesis was. How does it do in terms of explaining the minimal relevant features? Just horrible. It fails virtually every single one. In the first place, in terms of negativity, it's obvious that a medieval artist couldn't even conceive this type of thing. So, why on earth would an artist paint a reverse negative image? He couldn't even be able to conceive this until camera technology came around in the 1800s and that sort of thing. And Macrone knew this himself, and he tried to say, well, it was just a happy accident. It just happened somehow by accident. Okay, well, that's weird because there's no historical precedent for this in art history. Up until the shroud in the 1350s, allegedly, no human artist was able to accidentally stumble upon negative images. It was only with the shroud and subsequent images that were directly copying the shroud that achieved this. And it virtually fails all the other things. In terms of uniformity, it would not achieve uniform intensity of color because if you're using a paintbrush, the artist would apply varying degrees of paint and pressure and that sort of thing. So it wouldn't be uniform. It's impossible for them to achieve the 3-dimensionality and the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. Remember that straight line path. And look, Stirp actually tested this. They hired on certified forensic artists. And this is published in the peer review. And they were given certain anchor points to help them create this 3D image. And obviously, they had the help of modern technology to check their work, something a medieval artist wouldn't have. And they found it was virtually impossible. At best, they could get very limited three-dimensional effects, but it was just impossible to replicate the three-dimensionally perfect images of the Shroud of Turin because we don't have the hand-eye brain coordination necessary to shade at that low of a contrast. In terms of superficiality, again, at the microscopic level, this utterly fails. A wet substance like paint is going to soak through, and we're going to see evidence of what's called capillary action, where the fibers suck in the liquid and drag it down. Just like if you spill a drink on the carpet, it's going to be absorbed down into the carpet. Well, it's the same with the shroud. Something like the painting, a wet paint or pigment it's going to show evidence of capillary flow. It's not going to be on just the primary cell wall, and it's not going to be just the top to 2 to 3 layers. So this is an utter failure. On top of that, look, Stirp scientifically proved there was no paint or these pigments on the body images or the bloodstains. And Stirp tested for every single known organic and inorganic dyes, pigments, paints. Didn't find any evidence of these in the body images or in the bloodstains. They conducted dozens of spectral tests ranging from X-ray fluorescence, X-ray radiography, infrared, UV fluorescence, stuff like that. They did thousands of microchemical and chemical tests, as well as conducting their own optical or physical tests, and nothing was found. Well, I should clarify, nothing was found in a way that would suggest the images were composed of these pigments or anything. Now, Walter Macron, he was also a world-famous microscopist, and he basically said, he looked through his microscope and he said, no, I found the exact opposite. I found those images were composed of paint, these pigments. And he published his results in his own journal, mostly called The Microscope. So again, not peer review. Stirp, dozens, at least 2 dozen or more, secular peer review journals that they had no affiliation with. Macron published his results in his own journal, and those have been retracted by the Macron Institute today. You can't find them online anymore. They took them down. So yeah, and additionally, Macron never studied the shroud in person like Stirp did. All he did, he was given samples that he studied under his microscope. So he was totally unaware of the spectral tests and all the tests that Stirp had done. This kind of falsifies that. In terms of iron oxide, it has to be admitted this was found on the shroud, but through the X-ray fluorescence tests, it was proven that the iron oxide wasn't just in the images, as Macron said, it was uniformly found on the entire cloth. So this is attributed to what's known as the retting process. When you're making a linen cloth, in ancient times or in medieval times, they would put it in a body of water like a pond, and it would absorb iron and iron oxide, calcium, strontium. And Stirp actually scientifically tested some cloths created using the retting process. And guess what? They all had similar levels of iron oxide, strontium, and calcium that the Shroud of Turin was discovered on the Shroud of Turin. In terms of the vermilion pigment, I think I just need to say you need some common sense on this, right? Because it was found on one blood sample. And from this, Macron concludes, oh, well, all of the bloodstains must have been touched up with vermilion pigment. Well, no, how about we just postulate the most likely thing? Because number one, all the other tests falsify this. Vermilion was not found on any other blood sample on the shroud that was studied. And in terms of this particle, it's obvious it's just contamination. Look, there were a total of 27 contaminants that Macron and Stirp found on the shroud images, having nothing to do with how the images were created. I mean, we found a modern felt tip pen mark. We found pink nylon. We found an insect parts like a bug's legs. Are you going to say, well, that proves the shroud images were made from insect parts? No, I think you just have to have a little common sense. And This is just a vermilion pigment contamination particle that maybe got on the shroud when they were throughout history, in medieval history, they would put paintings on top of the shroud to kind of sanctify them. Again, I'm not Roman Catholic, so I don't know what they're doing, but it makes them a second order relic or something like that. So yeah, that obviously contamination gets on through that way. Okay, next is the proto-photo hypothesis. So this is another ordinary artistic mechanism by a guy named Nicholas Allen. And he basically posits that the Shroud of Turin was the world's first photograph, modern photograph. Some medieval artist invented modern photographic technology, and it was lost for centuries until the 1800s. But yeah, he kind of used a life-sized statue or sculpture of a human body. He hung it up. I'll show you guys, and you can see here's the statue. And then there's a little hole with a lens in the wall here that reflects the light onto a cloth that's been soaked in a silver nitrate solution. So silver, that's what makes film sensitive to light and how it captures the images. So basically, he's saying the shroud cloth, he turned it into some gigantic film that captured the reflected light and produced the body images. So here's the photographic negative results of what Nicholas Allen got on the left versus the Shroud of Turin. And in terms of negativity and high resolution, one thing that's immediately obvious is that these results are actually superior in terms of resolution to the Shroud of Turin. This is too good. So that's one way that you can rule out this method right away. Additionally, the three-dimensionality, Barry Schwartz plugged the results into the photo VP8 image analyzer. Look, this is nothing like the shroud face, which actually depicts a realistic three-dimensional face. This is totally obscured. It's composed of sort of hits and misses into the contact zones, like vertical cliffs and then steep valleys type thing. So you can see how it basically fails all of the various minimal relevant features in terms of uniformity. The silver nitrate emulsion that would be put on the cloth, it would not be uniformly distributed. Also, the images themselves, look at the results. You kind of get some areas that aren't even encoded at all. You get this black hole right in the middle of Jesus's belly. What happened there? There's no image there. You also get these white patches or bright spots that are inherent to the method. They're not uniform. These are based on the sun shining down on the feet and on the arms here, and they create these bright spots or these white areas. So it's impossible to create uniform images. Also, it's impossible for it to create the three-dimensionality and the vertically mapped wrapping distortions because, again, the body isn't lying down with the cloth naturally draped over it where there would be cloth to body distance, right? No, it's hung up over here horizontally, and then the images are over there. So by definition, it would not reproduce these features. And finally, in terms of the superficiality, again, because he treats it in that silver emulsion to make it sensitive to light, that thing is going to be, oh my gosh, it's going to be penetrated right to the back and covered in this emulsion type silver thing that they have. So it fails on that front. I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. Do you want me to speed up a bit or?
You're fine.
I'm fine. Okay, cool. So those are a couple of ordinary artistic ones. Let's switch to an ordinary naturalistic mechanism. So this time, no artist. We're just positing, look, there's a dead body and it was covered in a cloth. And then natural mechanisms took over to explain the images. And one of the most famous explanations on this front is Dr. Ray Rogers' gas diffusion or the Maillard reaction. And basically, Rogers proposed a Maillard chemical reaction. This is kind of it's a caramelization, caramels, the candies, that kind of color, that browning effect. And he says, well, that's what happened with the Shroud of Turin, as the shroud was kind of covered in this micro thin or superficial starch layer throughout the entire cloth. And Rogers argues that's just the way they did it in ancient times. That's debatable, but that's what his hypothesis says. And that interacted with the dead body, the gases that the dead body emitted as it decomposed over the 1 to 2 days or 3 days or so. And that created that chemical reaction known as the Maillard reaction, which created that straw yellow to brown color on the Shroud of Turin. Now, interestingly, in favor of this hypothesis, it has to be admitted, it is a scientific fact. Stirp did discover some starch impurities on the shroud. But Doctors Heller and Adler, part of Stirp, they didn't identify any starch itself, let alone these starch impurities being present on the entirety of the cloth. So just understand that's an assumption that Rogers is making as part of his hypothesis, that there was indeed starch on a microthin level all over the cloth. Okay, so how does Rogers' gas diffusion method do in terms of the minimal relevant features? Well, so far it's the best one of the bunch. So negativity, it affirms that. It also gets a green check mark on superficiality because, again, remember, his hypothesis assumes this micro-thin superficial starch layer on the shroud. Well, again, that's debatable. We can say that that's not true, or that's just an assumption on his part. But if we grant that that is true, then he would get a green check mark on superficiality. Yep, that would explain it. Also, additionally, there's no evidence of capillary flow or cementation of the fibers and stuff, or image saturation. That's another thing, that the images aren't as dark as they could be. They're only about 23%, plus or minus 5%, as dark as the images could be. And if you have a body that's rotting away and giving off these gases, you would expect to find a lot of decomposition liquids accumulating on the shroud and that sort of thing. And the images would be more saturated or darker than what we see with the shroud. So that's kind of a problematic thing. And Rogers tries to explain that by saying, oh, well, the body was removed within a couple days before there was sufficient time for these things to build up and affect this. But really, the Achilles heel for the Ray Rogers Maillard reaction is the three-dimensionality and the vertical mapping. That it's just, by definition, just think about it, right? And even Ray Rogers himself admits that his theory here fails or is incomplete, because gases, they don't just go in a vertical direction, and do they? I mean, no, they go out, they're isotropic. They go out in all directions equally. So you would get this blurred mess of an image. You wouldn't get highly resolved straight line vertically mapped three-dimensional images that correspond to the lights and darks of the images based on body to cloth distance. And again, Rogers himself admitted that his theory here fails on that front, and that the Maillard reaction at best is a partial explanation. It needs to work in conjunction with some other mechanism that could be used to guide the gases. But yeah, just in terms of the Maillard reaction itself, it's not going to do the trick. Okay, finally, we have an example of an extraordinary or supernatural type mechanism. And this is Dr. John Jackson's ultraviolet radiation hypothesis. And he first proposed this in 1989. And he says, look, at the time of Jesus' resurrection, Jesus' body became volumetrically radiant throughout its entire volume. And there was light in the vacuum of the ultraviolet range, and the body was simultaneously mechanically transparent. So that's how the body passed through the cloth and that sort of thing. And I guess that makes sense of Jesus going through walls later in the Gospels and stuff like that. You could say he was mechanically transparent type deal. But an aspect of John Jackson's theory involves this cloth collapse. So once Jesus' body became mechanically transparent and that sort of thing, and let loose this radiation throughout its volume there, the cloth collapsed or was sucked into the vacuum downwards for the upper one into the radiation, forming the frontal images. And at the bottom, it was sucked up into the vacuum, into the radiation, producing the dorsal images. So that's what some pro-shroud guys call the cloth collapse hypothesis, and he was the first to initiate that. But Jackson's team has done. There's been lots of experiments, including in secular peer-reviewed journals by people like Paulo de Lazzaro. UV light and or laser beams can actually be used to irradiate samples of linen cloth and create images that are similar to what we have with the straw brown yellow coloring on the Shroud of Turin. So yeah, this is a possibility in terms of creating images that at least look similar to what we have with the Shroud of Turin. But one thing I just want to note, because I actually don't follow John Jackson myself, that there are varying types of radiation hypotheses. Some of them differ. I go myself for Bob Rucker's radiation hypothesis, where he goes for more particle radiation as the explanation, and he doesn't posit any sort of cloth collapse. But anyways, aside from that, let's see how John Jackson does in terms of the minimal relevant features. Look at that, totally green. In terms of the 5 MRFs we're looking at, his radiation hypothesis explains every single feature that we have here. And I would say in terms of the fuller analysis, his thesis is able to explain, I think, all of the features related to the body images. There are some questions when it comes to the bloodstains type deal, but I'll save that because that's not part of this presentation. So that's it. I can finally shut up and go to you guys, and yeah, we'll go to Q&A.
All right, good deal. Thank you for that. Lewis, I think you had some questions before I ask mine. By the way, everybody, if y'all have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Just make sure to tag me at Reason and Theology so I can know that it's your question. But yeah, Lewis, go ahead and take it.
Yeah, I do have a few that I wrote down as you're going through the presentation. I just want to touch on some of the points that were brought up. One has to do with the origins of the shroud. So I believe that early on you mentioned there were 2 prevailing theories, right? The image of Edessa theory versus the image of God incarnate theory. So out of curiosity, which one do you think is more likely to be true between the 2 of those?
Yeah, so I'm actually studying that right now for my podcast and stuff. I've kind of been agnostic on it. I really I think I'm kind of leaning at this moment towards the image of God incarnate, because there are some serious academic problems with the image of Edessa theory, I think. So yeah, I guess I'm leaning that direction. So
right. Can you mention what some of those are?
Well, the first one is kind of straight up. This is what you'll see in the peer-reviewed literature from Byzantine historians and stuff. That they'll say, well, look, the Mandyline theory, mandil in Arabic means handkerchief or something, right? So it's only a image of the face, right? That's what we have in history about this image of Edessa or Mandyline. So it's not a full shroud cloth with full body images, and that's why most scholars reject this theory that are not pro-shroud.
I actually read about that objection somewhere from someone who supports the image of Edessa theory. Apparently the rebuttal to that is the reason why it only appeared to be the face was because the shroud was folded in such a way that was the only part that was visible. You think that would be a plausible rebuttal to that objection?
I do. And in fact, we have scientific evidence. We've seen through, I think, transmitted light photographs, we can see the fold patterns that the shroud was in, right? So we can see, for example, that it's consistent with the Man of Sorrows icon. Like there's a mechanism that would create fold patterns. And there's also this tetradipline that folded in 4 that would just show the face. So yeah, they have a counter response to that, but it's you have to assess. Yeah, you have to assess that.
Right. Yeah, so you're skeptical of it, but you're not ready to throw it out just yet.
I need to finalize my study. I'm going through all the evidence right now as we speak. So yeah.
All right, sounds good. So I want to run some shroud skeptic arguments by you. Some of them, funny enough, do come from Christian sources, mostly evangelical Protestants. There's one prominent evangelical apologetics organization that I'm not going to name, but they have a number of articles on this topic where they are decidedly in the anti-shrouds position. And one of the biblical arguments that they present against it is that if you look at John chapter 20, verses 5 and 7, it says that Jesus was wrapped with several linen strips rather than a single shroud. So, what would you say to that particular theory? I mean, that particular objection.
Yeah, it's not strips so much as cloths, right? And I'm not a Greek scholar, but there's a variety of things that fit that Greek vocabulary. But in terms of the multiple cloths, I mean, we have readily available explanations for that. So number one, I mentioned the head cloth is explained by the Sudarium of Oviedo, if those are linked. So those are separate things. Also, biblical scholars such as Ada Grossi, I've linked to her paper. She's done detailed analysis about first century burials and says that it's perfectly consistent with what they would have done back then, because number one, there would have been strips that bound the shroud cloth to the person. Gary Habermas has speculation maybe there was a chin strap. And in fact, scientifically, if you want, I can try to find a video and show it. But there's actually a strip along the whole side of the Shroud of Turin, so it was almost like cut off, and it was re-sewn in. And we can see. I could show it to your audience, Vary's eyes, if you want me to look up the video.
If it's not long, I think wouldn't be a problem showing it.
Okay. All right. Hang on. I'll very quickly.
Just as a reminder, y'all can put your questions there in the chat to @Reason and Theology.
BBC Shroud. Yeah, it's the cloth. Yeah, if you want to ask me another question while I'm trying to find that, then go ahead, just so we don't have dead air.
Well, I have a question. What about you mentioned the carbon dating and that they only used one sample, but normally you would need 3, I think is what you said. Why don't they just go ahead and do that? Maybe if you answered that, I must have missed it.
Yeah, so I didn't say you need 3, but that's what the original plan was. They were supposed to have 7 carbon dating labs and 3 samples from different areas of the cloth, but it's definitely required that you test from different areas. Every archaeologist and carbon-14 scientist knows that. Now, as to why the heck did they not go ahead and do that? It's essentially because why did it was the Catholic Church's fault, I have to admit, for this. Why did they change the procedure? Well, it's because carbon-14 is a destructive process, and they needed to destroy parts of the cloth to do that, and they were very worried about doing that in various areas. Now, ironically, I have to admit they were a little bit stupid, because they actually ended up destroying more of the cloth than if they had stuck with the original plan of 3 samples. But that's actually not a problem really today. We have material already taken from the shroud that could be carbon dated and from a different area. And we don't need to we can actually prove certain theories about explaining how the carbon dating came out without, they're non-invasive, without destroying the cloth at all. So yeah, why don't we carbon date it today with our modern technology? Barry Schwartz actually knows the people involved, and it's kind of a selfish thing. It's better for it to remain a mystery. They're making a lot of money from pilgrims, and it looks like there's no impetus to rock the boat. I think they're kind of scared about how the 1988 results came out. So that's my honest opinion as to why they don't do it today.
You would think it would be the exact opposite, because the previous results actually weren't in their favor and wouldn't be conducive for pilgrimages and such. And so you would actually think that they would have motivation to redo it.
I think so, but I can't get inside the Pope's head because he's the current owner and stuff. But it just seems there's a hesitancy to rock the boat because of how things went the last time around, and they're worried, like, if we do test this and it does come out the way we don't like, how is that? Is that
like before?
Like in 1988, yeah.
Right, like before. So it seems to me there's nothing to lose.
I agree with you. let's call up the Pope and tell him to get it done, because I agree with you. I think it's look, the shroud belongs to the world, and we have nothing to lose by testing it again. Look, if it's not true, I want to know, right? So let's test
Same
it.
here.
Yeah.
Same here. Lewis, I think you had some more there.
Yeah, so I do have. I want to run a couple of scenarios by you. Like I was trying, so we ruled out the whole, um, painting theory um, as well as
Proto-photo.
the camera theory. There's one other theory that popped up in my head on how you could possibly make a forgery explanation for this. What if assuming this was a forgery, the forger did use an actual dead body to produce the shroud? Like they took a dead corpse, made sure that had the rough same dimensions as what people would think the body of Jesus would be, put a crown of thorns and everything, and then wrapped a shroud around it. And that was the means by which they would be able to make a convincing looking forgery that would look, for all intents and purposes, like it was actually used to shroud a body.
Okay, and just so I understand, so you're not talking about the proto-photo using real body.
No,
You're saying
like
you could
an
put it
actual
in.
body was draped. The shroud was draped over an actual body. It's just not the body of Jesus.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I mean, I don't think it makes a difference whether an artist or people doing a funeral or in the first century put the body in the shroud. It would still have the same evaluation of, depending on what the mechanism is. Is it direct contact? Is it some gas diffusion? It's all going to be the same in terms of how we evaluate that. It doesn't matter who puts the body in the
Mhm.
shroud, really. But on that front, I will say some shroud skeptics supposing an artistic mechanism have used real bodies. So Luigi Garloscelli is a famous Italian skeptic and chemist, and he's realized that he goes for kind of a powder rubbing or frottage method, and he's realized, look, you can't use a sculpture or a bas relief to create the images because of those vertically mapped wrapping distortions. So he has kind of a hybrid thing. You have to use a bas relief for the face, then he uses a human body or torso for the torso, the frontal part, and parts of the legs and stuff like that. So there are some people who've proposed that, and they all fail. So yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so good to know that that's one of the theories that has been considered as well. Now, here's one other. This is less related to the authenticity of the shroud and more related to how the shroud relates to the truth of the Christian faith. Because you talked about how this could be a proof that the Christian faith is true. Jesus did rise from dead. But I can see like a plausible scenario where maybe the shroud is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, but it's not. But it doesn't prove Christianity is true. Like, let's say atheism is true, and then in fact that means that Jesus died, was draped, and then he just stayed dead. Or here's another scenario. What if Islam is true? And as most Muslims have said, someone else was crucified instead of Jesus. So in that scenario, the authentic burial shroud is that of whoever was made to resemble Jesus and was crucified in his place.
Yeah, so that's a great question, kind of thing that's outside of my presentation, but something that I deal with. I had Arif Khan on my show. He's I don't know if you know who that is, but
Mhm.
did you know that Ahmadiyya Muslims officially, the Catholic Church doesn't officially accept the shroud, but Ahmadiyya Muslims, their caliph, I guess it's called, he, as of
Yeah.
2010, they all accept the Shroud of Turin as the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and
Yeah.
they attribute it as proof of the swoon theory, believe it or not. So we have to get into this next level question on the philosophical end. So how do I say that? Let's say the images are extraordinary or miraculous in some way. I grant that. Well, why is that proof for Christianity? And the way I would answer that is based on how I identify religion authenticating events. So it has certain three criteria, right? So number one, you have to prove whatever the event is, and then secondly, you have to prove that they are extraordinary. So that's my level of proving. Okay, what are the features? What about the explanatory hypotheses? Is it extraordinary or not? But then there's this third criterion, which is, as Mike Licona would say, the context charged with religious significance. And I look for three factors here. So number one is the event sufficiently attached to the religion, right? So in the case of the shroud, it obviously depicts Jesus of the Gospels dying by being scourged and crucified and that sort of thing. Additionally, it also implicitly attests to the resurrection because there are no decomposition liquids or anything found on the shroud and that sort of thing. This proves that the body had to be removed within a couple days of that shroud. However it got removed, I would say it's the resurrection implied. It left the shroud, leaving behind these extraordinary images. That's an attestment to the resurrection claim, I would say.
Mhm.
And because of that, these images serve to authenticate the Christian religion. Islam does not attest to the resurrection of Jesus, let alone debatable, but let alone the death by crucifixion and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
I know some Muslims debate that and stuff, right? But thirdly, the event itself can't be subsumable. And I've never encountered anyone talking about miracle subsumability, right? So look, there are certain miracle claims that are common to different religions, right? So, for example, if we could prove Moses parted the Red Sea, who gets it? Does that prove Judaism? Does that prove Christianity? Who gets that? Or does it prove Islam, right? So, the way I approach that question is the first religion chronologically to claim a given event, they get it by default, unless the later subsuming religion can, one, prove that the miracle's not contradictory to their doctrines or teachings. Number two, they have their own independent religion authenticating miracles, not related. And thirdly, the overall probability for that religion's being true is more than 50% and or greater than the other, the original religion. So
Right.
that's how I would settle that question.
Yeah. So maybe it would be best to see the shroud as part like a cumulative case alongside other arguments for the resurrection.
Of course, yeah. When I came to faith, I had the four positive evidences that kind of gave me my 53.14. I always sound weird with that, but yeah, I came to faith with 53.14% probability, and the four positive evidences were the Shroud of Turin, the historical evidence for the resurrection, what I call the vindication prediction argument, and then the inner witness of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, I will admit I've never really read up on Bayesian probabilities, so I have no idea how those numbers are calculated. So we'll have to talk about that sometime.
Sounds good. Yeah, I did an
Yeah.
entire show. I will admit I'm not using Bayes proper because I don't use conditional probability. So mine's a little more of a Bayes-ish method, I would say.
Okay. So use like your own method in a way.
Essentially, I'm just getting the cumulative. I'm assigning my own subjective credences to them, and then I use Bayes just to get, okay, well, how do I put those pieces together? Like I have these various positive evidences and then negative evidences. What's the cumulative overall thing of that? So
Right.
Yeah.
I have one more question, and then maybe we'll get to the audience ones. So one of the things that, so for me, like, I'm still thinking this issue through. I think on balance, the shroud is more likely to be authentic than not. One piece of evidence that I think is underrated is the fact that the shroud presents Jesus as being nailed through the wrists. If you look at a lot of pre-modern crucifixion art, they present Jesus as being nailed through the palms. I think the crucifix right behind Michael is a good example of that. So I don't think anyone in the Middle Ages realized that crucifixions were done through the wrist. I think that was a modern discovery. So if the shroud was a forgery, how did the forger know to put the nail marks on the wrist rather than the palms? Like, do you think that's a good argument for the shroud?
Sort of. I think it's a great point, but just so you're aware, shroud skeptics, they've actually contradicted that and said, no, it comes from it actually is in the palms. I think that's provably wrong. But remember, we don't have the entry wound. We just have the exit wound. But I
Mhm.
think based on it looks like it's kind of the lower part of or sorry, the around this part here.
Mhm.
So it is akin with the wrists, but there is some controversy. I will say that it is, to my mind, scientifically proven. It's not through the palms of the hands, regardless of the fact that we only have the exit wound. We can, most medical experts, Robert Buckland, for example, he's the guy that they created the Quincy Medical Show after, and Frederick Zugby. We can tell, yeah, this is consistent with how they did actual crucifixion. It's not through the palms as the medieval guys. So, yeah, I
Mhm.
would agree it's a good argument, but with some qualification.
Okay, sounds good.
All
Awesome.
right. So let's see here. Caleb says, is it true that the arms of the man in the shroud are disproportional and that a body in rigor mortis wouldn't rest in that position?
A body in rigor mortis wouldn't rest. So it's in terms of the disproportionality of the arms. I would say this has been falsified, right? So we have a list of over 24 medical experts that have examined the shroud anatomically and forensically, dating back to the 1900s at the French Academy of Sciences with an agnostic medical doctor, Yves Delage, for example. So it's they. I guess they've all been fooled because they see this as anatomically accurate. Additionally, there's been a peer-reviewed study, a computer anthropometric study has found that the man is indeed inconsistent with general anthropomorphic dimensions. Now, it is true that to the naked eye, to the layman, even to myself, it does look like they're off or slightly disproportional. Some things are, so for example, the fingers are longer to the naked eye. Now, why would stuff come about like that? There are some anatomical inaccuracies, and basically there are various explanations, right? So number one, we can't prove how are the images created. It depends on what the mechanism is, would explain for some of these inaccuracies. Also, what was the position of the body and the cloth in relation to the body? So with the fingers, that's kind of because they're curved. I mean, scientifically, if you do that and it's irradiated, you're always going to have an extended effect kind of thing. So this doesn't disprove there's a body. It just shows that the fingers were curved at the time the images were put on. Now, in terms of the arms, some people have said that maybe one of the shoulders is dislocated and that sort of thing to try and explain it. But I go with more of the expert's opinion that there is nothing wrong here. It just appears that way because the elbow is cut off. We can't really see where the elbow exactly is bent. And obviously, it's in rigor mortis. We can tell that from the stiffness of the butt and stuff like that. And it looks like someone has kind of jolted. It was in rigor mortis in the outstretched position from the blood flows, and somebody broke the rigor mortis, and then it reset in an awkward position type thing. So that's really what we're seeing is based on these unknown variables about the position of the cloth, the position of the elbow, which we can't tell, and how the rigor mortis was reset after they moved the arms down to cover his groin. So yeah, there's no proof that it's disproportional. It's just you're just kind of making a subjective judgment with your eyes. And I don't know about you, but I'm not a medical expert, so I trust Bob Buckland and those guys who studied it.
Could they use the burned areas of the cloth for new C4 testing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they with the new technology they could do that. I think there would be maybe some issues because obviously the burnt areas and the fire areas might have like ordinary contamination issues to worry about, like from smoke and stuff like that. But yeah, like I said, we've got fibrils right now sitting in a vault, just sitting there. We don't have to touch the shroud, and let's just date those. And people like Bob Rucker and stuff, we've been submitting scientific proposals to date this material, and this would prove conclusively about the carbon dating of the shroud. So yeah, it's just a matter we're trying to get approval, but so far we're not getting it.
There's another question here. Sorry, here it is. Is our guest familiar with the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe? Kind of a related question to these kinds of studies. Are you familiar
Oh,
with them?
I am not. No.
Yeah, might want to look into it. Somewhat related. Looking through the chat here, I see more comments, but I'm not seeing any more questions. So I think I grabbed them all. Oh, well, here's one. Who has possession of the shroud samples?
Giulio Fonte, and he's the one who did those. So how are we getting these dating tests? Right? Remember those 4 physical tests that I mentioned? Well, it's
Hmm.
because Giulio Fonte actually possesses the remaining shroud samples, so he's able to conduct tests without getting the Pope's approval and stuff. So yeah, I think he's at the University of Padua there. So.
What about the bits of the shroud still in Oxford University? Can't they use that?
Well, that would be from the same sample. So we would just get, even if everything worked out, we would just get the same result. So I don't think it would be helpful really. Like what we would expect to get the same medieval results because it's the same sample. Now, one thing I will say is that Christopher Ramsey, back in 2008, we were able. One of the explanations for the carbon-14 being erroneous is known as carbon monoxide hypothesis of contamination. It's an extraordinary form of contamination, just like my hypothesis of neutron irradiation. And they actually scientifically tested that at the labs. Now, unfortunately, that was scientifically falsified. So that we know that that is not the explanation for the erroneous carbon dating now. But yeah, we were able to use Oxford Labs, and Christopher Ramsey there helped conduct some of those experiments. And he was on board. He says that, look, the evidence is contradictory. We can't just blindly follow the 1988 carbon dating. He says, look, there's so much evidence that's contradictory. We have to do more testing before we decide. And he's the head of Oxford Labs himself.
What about that one 3D replica where the scientist said the blood wouldn't flow that way? Sorry if this was addressed.
No problem. So I think what he's referring to is the 2018 blood pattern analysis that was done by the atheist Luigi Garlashelli and another forensic expert. And this was This was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. It's a credible, secular, peer-reviewed science journal. You can't just ignore that either. And I've done several shows kind of refuting it, but they did a series of 6 experiments and that sort of thing, testing certain things. And the main problem with it is in their starting assumptions and also in their methodology for testing certain things. So just one example, right, where it would be disanalogous, they tested kind of what's called the blood belt on the small of the back. And the way they did that, they tested it on the skin of a plastic mannequin. Now, do you think that the plastic mannequin is going to be consistent with human skin after it had been scourged and crucified and was dehydrated, was in hypovolemic shock? The consistency of the blood, basically they kind of used synthetic blood for some of their experiments. It was akin to runny water.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, that's not going to be the case with the blood of Jesus after everything he went through. It's going to be the blood clotting resources will be depleted and stuff like that. It's not going to be consistent. So there are various disanalogies, I guess is my answer, that say that these results are totally irrelevant to what happened with the Shroud Man. Yeah.
Oh, okay. What got you interested in studying the shroud? Any particular moment that inspired it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have to always give credit to my friend, Dr. Gary Habermas. It's all because of him. So I kind of lost my faith around 2009, 2010. Lewis knows about that because we went to the same church. So I left for about 8 years, and I was doing religious research, and I was helped by, lots of people who I'm grateful to, Tony Costa, Mike Lacona, but above all was Gary Habermas. And it was him who introduced me to the Shroud. And I was amazed. Before that, I'm like, oh, it's just a Catholic relic. I don't believe that. But when I saw him as a Protestant actually taking it seriously, it kind of forced me to open my mind and say, let's actually look at the evidence. And yeah, from there, I met people like Barry Schwartz, who's Jewish, and he's pro-Shroud. And he was telling me he was the official Stirp photographer back in 1978. But yeah, he was showing me all of the peer-reviewed papers, the science. And once I saw that, I was hooked into looking into the details.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoyed this. This was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for this presentation. Lewis, did you have any other questions that you wanted to get in there? Any other comments, questions?
Nope. I think I satisfied my curiosity regarding this topic, and I'm very thankful that Dale was able to present all his research for us.
Awesome.
Yeah, this was very helpful. Thank you so much for doing this. And yeah, check out the Tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe and maybe do some research on that. Tell us what you come up with that if you do.
Is it like they have images on a thing or
The
something?
tilma is supposed to be something that is related to an apparition of the Virgin Mary, and there's a lot of interesting scientific research behind it. So definitely check it out.
Yeah, I'll say for your audience will appreciate this and stuff because Giulio Fonte has done a lot of research into the Eucharistic type
Mm,
miracles, and
mhm,
especially he takes what's called the divine photography hypothesis. It's an electrostatic mechanism for explaining the images. Again, supernatural, but he has studied the holy fire of Jerusalem
mhm,
phenomenon
mhm,
scientifically, and he believes that fire was that the energy of that fire is what kind of explains the shroud images. So
mm.
I don't go for that myself, but it's something worthy of looking into. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much once again for coming on. And hey, Lewis, thank you for joining us and asking these wonderful questions and for this segment here with Reason and Theology, your segment with
Yep.
1P3. So I really
Yep.
appreciate you coming on and doing this.
My pleasure.
All right. Hey, everybody, hit that subscribe button and the like button. Also, put a comment there in the comment section so that we know what you think. Do you believe the shroud is authentic now that you watch this? Or do you still have questions? Make sure to put them in the comment section. All right. That's going to do it, y'all. See you later. God bless.